All right. Hey, Morgan, what's up? Hey, this is Ryan Hartwig here interviewing Morgan Kaman, another Facebook insider and whistleblower. I'm really excited. Was super excited when I saw the video come out. So we're just going to have a really great conversation today, just chat about your experience and everything that's been going on since you went public. For those that don't know, I went public last year in June of 2020. And so kind of a similar experience with Morgan, and we'll just go through some questions here. And if you want to ask me questions too, Morgan, about my experience and some of what I uncovered, we have a lot to talk about. And
Sure.
so let's go for it.
So yeah, basically, I was working through a third-party skilled labor provider who is providing skilled labor for Facebook at a data center near where I live. And I was a data center technician, and basically what I did in my job is I would take tickets from like the production operations engineers who were actually full-time Facebook employees directly for Facebook. So they would give us tickets, and then we would take these support tickets and we would take them into the data center and say like, okay, you needed like a motherboard swapped, or you need some software updated, or something like that. And we would do special projects with these software engineers and product engineers and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And one day we were sitting there, and one of my coworkers brought me this document, and he was like, hey, did you check this out? And I was like, no. And it was on something called Workplace, which is an interior platform, an internal platform on Facebook, which is like a social media platform, but only for internal employees. And someone had posted this, and it was a document or a series of documents, but it was all in one like packet, and it was detailing a censorship campaign that Facebook was developing, and that to censor what they called vaccine hesitancy.
Okay.
And as soon as I saw the words vaccine hesitancy, I was like, what? And censorship, I was like, why would that need to be censored? Then the further I looked into it, the worse it got, basically.
Yeah.
And
So
I was,
that was but you had normal access to these documents. This wasn't
yeah.
restricted. Like you were allowed to have access to these documents, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I hadn't even worked there for a year, and I had access to these documents because they were posted, right on one of the FYI pages for all the people that lived in the work region.
Okay. So you were a contractor similar to me. So I think it's similar. So I was a contractor. I was working directly for Cognizant, and we had the contract for content moderation. We were also using Workplace. We also had single review tool, SRT. So I don't know. So ours was called, we would call like SRT Workplace. I don't know if maybe that was unique to us because we used single SRT, where that was where we viewed the images that came in one by one that we had to decide whether to delete or leave on. So you were basically kind of like tech support, back-end tech support for Facebook, right?
Yeah, and we also did like routine maintenance on the servers too,
Okay.
and special projects. Sometimes they'd be like, hey, we're retrofitting all these servers, so we need you guys to help us out. So we would do stuff like that a lot.
Okay. So, wow. So you had pretty, I mean, I would say you had more access to things than me. People are always surprised because I was kind of like an entry level position as a content moderator, and I was making like $15 an hour, to be honest. And, but we still had access to a lot of those documents. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and I did have that access to a lot of things. In fact, they were very strict about handling media that had user data on it, because I switched out hard drives and other storage media quite often. Every single day that I worked, really.
Yeah.
And there was one time where I was nearly fired right after my training process because there were lockers in there where you had to lock the storage media, and they had a very strict step-by-step process you had to follow. And I left a locker open one time.
Wow.
I almost got fired for that. So yeah, it's like a zero tolerance policy.
Yeah, we couldn't bring cell phones on the floor, or anything like that. It was pretty strict as far as that goes, and like instant termination if you had accidentally brought your cell phone on the floor. But yeah, my job was studying like the policy, Facebook's policy, for about while I was there, almost 2 years, and all the nuances. And in your interview with James O'Keefe, you mentioned like Facebook's public policy versus private policy, and how like the public policy is very vague. And I definitely understand that. And Facebook's internal policy is super, super nuanced, but I didn't really see the data aspects of what you saw. So in the interview, you mentioned some terms like position change, indirect discouragement, tier 2. The tiers sound familiar to me because we would use a tier system as well. So we delete something for, hate speech tier 1 or tier 2.
Right.
But but I can totally see them doing something similar to that. I know that they use and we can touch on this more in detail, but they use the AI classifiers, I guess, to
Yeah,
pull
they do.
jobs. Yeah, let's talk about the classifiers. What does that mean in the
So
context of your job?
So basically, it's like a system or an algorithm that classifies, whatever you put into it. There's an input and an output, and in this case, it would be content like comments and stuff like that. And they, as in the teams at Facebook that were involved in this, the health integrity teams, they would be the ones to program like how these were basically sorted. And so, they had different tiers. Kind of like you would sort really anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So for example, we would be getting, here's a perfect example. So of how we saw the classifiers in action. So those that don't know, like I was as a content moderator, I don't control what gets on my screen. I just click next and boom, I get an image, I get a comment one at a time, and I have to decide, okay, do I keep it or do I delete it? But Facebook throws those in our queue. And so then the AI can also scrape through and like look for certain keywords and dump those into our queue. So we had Greta Thunberg who was being attacked and being called retarded, like retarded. So I
Yeah.
mean, so yeah, it is what it is. But she's a public figure. She's being attacked, right?
Mhm.
We know she's autistic, so there's that aspect to it. And I don't condone any kind of attacks like that. Obviously, we don't want. But if you're just attacking her because of her, policy on climate change, hey, she's a public figure. That's fair game, right?
Yeah, she
So
takes that risk.
yeah.
Yeah,
So anyways,
and with these
yeah,
classifiers,
yeah,
they attach attributes to this content that are used further down the line to further, put them into different boxes, and especially when they go to like a human rater.
So Facebook made an exception for Greta Thunberg and said we can't allow any kind of attacks. We can't allow her to be called retarded, and they made an exception to their policy to prohibit any of those attacks. So that specific phrase retarded was put into their AI classifiers. So for an entire week straight, all I got pretty much were retarded jobs that I got into my queue and I had to delete. So that was all I did for a week. So that's how the AI. So that's how it would work. Then the AI classifiers would basically take those, like search for those, scour the internet or Facebook for all those keywords, and
Hmm.
then is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, well, and they would have like, keywords that specifically related to COVID, like COVID-19 vaccine, I don't know. There's literally, millions of words that they can put in there, and they had over like 66 languages that they
Yeah.
were adding words in. So it's just this ever expanding, just like tar that just like coats everything it touches, and you can't get it off.
Yeah. No, that's something that a lot of people don't realize is like the policy that I was working with is a global policy. So there were things
Same.
like, yeah, it was, you mentioned 66 languages. I reviewed content in Latin America as well as North America.
Yeah, it's
But
an action against humanity itself.
yeah,
Everyone who uses Facebook.
yeah. I mean, you firsthand saw like the global reach that Facebook has, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah. So the data center where I was working was one of their primary population centers, and yeah, they had data from all over the world, and um, like we were
wow,
saying, 66 languages. So if you can imagine how many countries that is,
jeez.
yeah.
So you had user data on those servers. So we of course had to delete child pornography, and it was very strict about how we handled that, and certain things we would raise to law enforcement. So on the data that you handled, the user data, would it contain messages? Could there possibly be like child pornography on some of those servers, the data that you handled, or was it just user data, like the
I mean,
metadata?
it's certainly a possibility. I mean, they had literally, an unimaginable level of storage there. I mean, it's a hyperscale data center, and it's only expanding, still expanding as we speak. And
Wow.
they're always planning on expanding it. And I actually saw an article recently. I forgot where it was, but I recently saw an article saying that Facebook was having action taken against them in a court against, they were ruled against for failing to protect their users against sex trafficking,
Yeah.
specifically their teen users. So, and that's a big deal. And so, yeah, if there was, CP on some of their servers, that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I didn't have access to all of them. They did have several places on site that were, behind locked doors that only direct Facebook employees were allowed to, basically touch at all. I could look at it, but I couldn't do anything beyond that. So
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, it is a concern because there's so much data, and you know they and I'll touch on this briefly, and then we'll talk about how Facebook always says, well, we can't moderate every content. Well, we can't moderate every piece of content. Well, in a way, with the AI, I think it's almost possible. They can flag a lot of stuff. But as far as child nudity goes, so in my book, Behind the Mask of Facebook, which you can see behind me here,
sure.
it's coming out in a couple months, and I worked on it for about 6 months after I went public last year, and it has all these exceptions, all the examples. Um, and so, yeah, there was an example where Facebook gave an exception to allow child nudity. Can you believe it? Maybe you can believe it. I mean, but let me just read this real quick and then we'll discuss. So they said there's a trending image of an album cover for the Brazilian band Negritude Jr. The album cover does violate our child nudity policy. However, given the artistic value of this album, as well as the public interest value, Facebook has decided to make a newsworthy exception, and these are fully nude toddlers. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it really says a lot about Facebook and what they pick to censor and what they don't pick to censor. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
They rush hard against things like, conservative news outlets and stuff like that, and they're very specific on that when it comes to like what's a conspiracy theory and that's just one of the examples of one of the attributes they tag it with, like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory or vaccine hesitancy. But then, like the example you just gave, it's like,
Mm-hmm.
well, where's the outrage there? Like, where's the rushing hard against? Well, we need to have an investigation about this. It was just like, nope. Well, it has artistic value, so it's like,
Yeah.
well, really anything could have artistic value because artistic value is subjective. So
Mm-hmm.
what does that
Yeah.
even mean? Once again,
Yeah.
it's super vague when it's public facing.
Yeah. It's just amazing what they can get away with, and like who approves these decisions, who decides what's newsworthy, and I spoke with Ivory Hecker last week and did an interview, and same thing goes for news stories, and they can pretty much choose pickers and winners, um, choose winners and losers. And
Yeah.
another phrase, so something I was trying to look into when I was there, but I didn't really get too far, is they had these tags for, it was called the fire brigade. So one was called a high pry X check tag, mid pry X check tag, basically for their business partners, so that we didn't accidentally delete a high profile business account. So I don't know if you had anything. Did you ever see anything like that? Like about like fire brigade or X check tags?
Not necessarily probably like, directly like that, but one section that they did have in the bundle of documents that I released is they had a section where they were talking about how certain pages, which they referred to as authoritative health pages,
Okay.
or something like that, or authoritative health sources, something like the CDC or the WHO or the NIH, those pages were given special treatment, and they were actually specifically targeted for the suppression of vaccine hesitancy content.
Okay.
So,
Authoritative health pages. Okay.
yeah,
Um, let's see. So we had those keywords like shadow ban that of course are brought into our vocabulary, and now we have vaccine hesitancy, of course. One that I think hasn't gotten as much attention as it should. Because everyone now that watches James O'Keefe, Project Veritas, they now are familiar with vaccine hesitancy. The other one is barrier to vaccination, and then you also mentioned, we talked about position change. So let's talk about those two phrases, like B2V, barrier to vaccination, and let's talk about position change. So what are those?
so barrier to vaccination is a broadly used term that they use to categorize like a huge list of groups and initiatives within Facebook. But basically, they're saying the term that they use is actually kind of worrying for me, because when they say barriers to vaccination, when you use the word barrier, that's because you have a certain place that you're trying to go and there's a barrier getting there. So it's
Yeah.
like what's their ultimate goal here? So the way that they describe it is, yeah, barrier to vaccination, and that would be things like misinformation online, and if they didn't censor the content, that would be a barrier to vaccination, and conspiracy theories would be considered barriers to vaccination,
Yeah.
or like religious beliefs that would tell you or instruct you not to get a vaccine would be considered a barrier to vaccination, your own
Mm-hmm.
religion.
Yeah.
And as far as position change goes, that's one of the actions that's taken against the content. And basically, if the content, if the comments you're looking at are sorted by, ranked status,
Mm-hmm.
then if you have like the top comment that's going to be in the preview, and then you can click more or like replies to see the inline comments under that.
Mm-hmm.
If something has a really high vaccine hesitancy score, according to the algorithm or the human rater or both, it's going to be several position changes down. So it's going to change the position within that hierarchy of comments so that it's less visible to the user. So, for example, it would move it to the very bottom so that you might have to scroll all the way to the bottom of a list of maybe 1,000 comments just to see something that had a higher VH score than something that didn't. And so it would appear as if all of the comments are pro-vaccine. So you're like,
Yeah.
wow, it would make you feel isolated, like, wow, I'm the only one that's not pro-vaccine, when in fact that may not be the case, and often is not the case.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's really fascinating. So, yeah, that position change, that's especially interesting for me because I would delete groups and pages and comments and posts, but it didn't tell us on our end what the impact was. After I deleted someone's comment, it didn't say, okay, the user has been, suspended for 7 days. I didn't know what the end effect was of my censorship. I just deleted things. We had, sometimes we had appeals, but it didn't really give us much information. Like a group would appeal, and then we'd look at the page again and decide if it was violating. And yeah, and so, but yeah, I didn't really see the impact. So these people I was deleting, yeah, maybe it was a 7-day ban, maybe 30-day ban. I didn't really know, but yeah, just lots of examples. We had an example about abortion, how people gave us guidance. Facebook gave us guidance about abortion, saying abortion is not considered a violent death, and fetuses are not considered human. So that's big. And then just newsworthy exceptions, like Don Lemon saying white males are terror threats, and Facebook says that's we're making an exception. And even so far as allowing attacks against straight white males. So during Pride Month, they sent out guidance saying, hey, it's okay. We know this violates our hate speech policy, but if you say straight white males are filth for not supporting LGBT, we're going to allow that. So like that's the crazy thing about their policy is, okay, they have these rules, but whenever they want, they can just break their own rules, right?
Yeah, it's basically, the way I see it is the technology is evolving faster than the majority of humanity's moral compasses can keep up with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're gaining power over people in the information age. Having information on people is power. And if having information on people is power, then Facebook is the king of the world. And so they have all this information, and it's like they're a 4-year-old driving, like a semi truck with a huge load on it. It's like they're just crashing into these barriers and just, learning on this crash course how to drive this thing and, screw the consequences. That's really what it feels like, until they're like, well, we'll make this decision. Like, for example, when they were talking about how like to promote vaccination and stuff like that, and then the CDC comes out and says, oh, well, actually, like, people got banned for saying that kids shouldn't take the vaccine, and then the CDC comes out and says, actually, yeah, kids shouldn't take the vaccine. And then it's like, okay, well, what about all these people that got banned then? Facebook's like, well, actually, yeah, now you can't say it because now it's a part of the accepted narrative. And it's like, that's just not, I think it's too much power. It's like the ring in Lord of the Rings. It's nobody can carry it.
Yeah.
It's too much.
Well, Mark Zuckerberg's slogan, the company slogan was like move fast and break things for a while. I think they since then abandoned that slogan, but it seems like they still practice that slogan in principle.
Yeah, now it's they have it hung up all over the data center where I work. Now it's move fast and but safely, or some of them say move fast and with purpose or something like that. But
yeah, or maybe it should be like move fast and allow child nudity. Like
yeah, really. But I
or
feel like, there's a lot of people that work there, and they're just like, well, I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to put my stick in my neck out there, no matter how good the cause may be.
yeah, or move fast and get jabbed, right?
Yeah, exactly. Move fast and be quiet.
Yeah. No, it's pretty incredible what you uncovered. I mean, just having that much access. I was gonna mention something here about. Yeah, I mean, we would delete things for different categories. So I would delete things for spam, or I would see like a terrorist post, or we'd see rape or cartel violence, beheadings, so lots of different things. But spam, I mean, we would delete, for example, as far as health goes, there were some things we would delete. Like if there's that spam where you like click on it, it's like lose 50 pounds in 10 days. just
Oh
like a
yeah,
totally
yeah.
outrageous claim, we would delete some of those. So I can see how they could expand like their health policy, I guess. It was called a different name, like it was called regulated goods. But we also deleted, claims about crisis actors. So if you claimed that the Sandy Hook shooting was staged or whatever, we would delete that. So that kind of goes into the same kind of realm where you're okay. So people can't have an opinion, or people can't voice their opinion about the vaccine. And once again, they're choosing who the authority is. So there's the WHO. I mean, they
Or
uh,
Dr. Anthony Fauci.
yeah, or Dr. Fauci. I mean, yeah, the CDC. They're a regulatory agency, but they're not Congress. What they're passing is not a law. So I think Facebook just should focus more on, okay, what's against the law? Child nudity is against the law. How about we never make any exceptions for child nudity? Um, so yeah, there's countless examples like that, like even like human smuggling. And in my book, I talk about how Facebook allows, like, obviously a trafficker can't say, hey, I'm looking for people to cross the border. It's $5,000 a pop. But the victim themselves they can say, hey, I'm looking for someone to take me across. So that comment is allowed on Facebook, and you can talk about bypassing border patrol, like, oh, border patrol doesn't go here from 9 to 5 p.m. on the weekends. So those things are clearly against the law. I mean, you're talking about bypassing, breaking federal laws, but Facebook turns a blind eye. So I just really like to see that more of a focus on that, with Facebook is focusing on, okay, what are the laws? Let's try to prevent people from breaking the law on our platform.
Yeah, they're really trying to have their cake and eat it too, in all these situations where they try to censor things or they don't, where they selectively censor, because it's like, okay, well, you need to hardcore censor and police everything or nothing. Because if you're going to try and sit there and say, well, this is and this isn't, then there's no logic you can come up with as a human to justify, well, why shouldn't we censor the comment for the person looking to get over the border, but we should censor the comment of the person offering the services? It's like, just either ban both of them or don't ban any of them and just say you can have it on here. And if the users of Facebook themselves want to police the community, they can do that.
Yeah.
But social ostracism. But Facebook is just like the government. They believe they have so much power and they need to wield it to come in and say, well, we'll do it for you, and you can rely on us, and don't worry, and don't trust your own instinct, don't trust yourself, just trust us. So
Yeah, and they can, I have examples where they actually allowed more attacks against police, and certain name calling towards police. So how does that help prevent real world violence if that's their goal? And yeah, they're priorities. So when Alex Jones got banned, like we literally had a guidance that said emergency update. And then during the elections, preparing for the 2018 midterms and the 2020, we had some Democrat debates going on. I think it was Hillary Clinton and someone else, and Facebook said they needed urgent visibility into those trends. So now we're seeing, okay, they're not following the rules, they're allowing child nudity, but in addition to that, they're actively looking for trends. Like we were supposed to surface any trends up to Facebook, whether it was Boogaloo or Trump's impeachment. So why the hell do they care about political trends? Like if it's not breaking the rules, why the hell do they care?
yeah, it really makes you wonder if Mark Zuckerberg himself is just this puppet, and he's just too naive as a person. He has too much faith in humanity to think, oh, nobody would ever take over my company and try to bend it towards their own malicious wills.
Yeah.
But maybe that's what happened. Maybe there are people that are a huge board. That's what I think. Some big committee or some board, some corporate board that are controlling Facebook and saying, it's basically like pay to play. Like, okay, this client wants this message put out, and they want to censor all this.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, and people ask me about that a lot. In the last year, I've done quite a few interviews, probably at least 100 interviews. And people always ask me, what is Mark Zuckerberg's motive? Is he just evil, or is he like, what's the reason for what he's doing? And yeah, there might be some influences behind him that are making those decisions or influencing it. I mean, if you think about it, it's one of the most powerful tools we have. You think about technology and how it's used to control wealth and influence the world. I mean, yeah, information, like you were talking about before, information is power. And so in that regard, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook is the most important tool. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's, foreign governments that are trying to use that influence. There was a data scientist at Facebook who came forward as well, named Sophie Zhang, and she got published in BuzzFeed News. And she was talking about how Facebook wasn't prioritizing certain elections in South America and how they're just kind of like, it wasn't a focus for them. And yeah, I think it's very possible that, dictatorships on the left and the right in South America are using Facebook to manipulate people and manipulate elections. You use a lot of bots and AI. So, I mean, yeah, anybody who wants power is going to try to use Facebook to its advantage. Um, so, so her point is, she said like, oh, I have blood on my hands, because she was in charge of kind of like monitoring and tracking, controlling some of those people who were trying to manipulate Facebook. But she said that, Facebook really prioritized the U.S. elections, but didn't really care too much about some of these smaller South American countries. But I definitely saw how they were prioritizing U.S. elections. It was a huge focus. Just alone at my workplace, they hired probably 1,000 to 1,500 people, and they
Wow.
really ramped up. But the whole reason they brought us to the U.S., like after 2016, they told us, was to prevent Russian interference in the elections. I
Wow.
mean, so that was a huge investment for Facebook.
Really makes you think
Yeah,
about Venezuela's elections recently.
yeah,
And also, I really hope that the world's going to have a moment, hopefully in the future, but the near future, where like we had with the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb, where we're like, okay, like this is it. Like we cannot do this anymore. Like we have to dismantle all this because we're gonna destroy ourselves. This is too much. I think people are gonna see that because in the beginning it was like, well, if Facebook intrudes too much in my life, then I'll worry about it. And
hmm
now it's getting to the point where it's like we turn back around and we're like, holy crap, it's seeped into everything.
yeah.
So
It's tough. It's a really difficult dilemma, because it's so much more integrated than, like the some of that military technology, like the atomic bomb. Okay, that was the military. All right, may control that, but now we have smartphones, and the technology is so infused in our lives. Um, yeah, so it can be dangerous, and we look at AI and how that can be dangerous. Um, it can be a threat to humanity.
weapon of
Um,
mass destruction for sure.
yeah. So taking a step back, you mentioned like the Manhattan Project. I was thinking about. I just read a book about the Korean War, and how the bombers during the Korean War, they love to use napalm. They're like, napalm's great. Like, we can. It's a horrific tool that was used, and it wasn't the most effective strategy, to be honest. They thought it worked, but like, as far as the Chinese forces, they had a way to bypass that, and they moved their their supplies with backpacks, essentially, in little sleds. So
Mm.
when the Vietnam War came around, they're like, oh, napalm was great, so we'll just use more napalm. So it was kind of this technology they were using, but it really had some really bad effects. It did, you know, maybe it helped win the Korean War, but it's kind of like using you know, a hand grenade to, I don't know, I don't know a good analogy, but it's
Weed the
kind of,
garden.
it's overkill. Yeah, yeah, it's using like a hand grenade to weed the garden. Yeah,
Yeah, well, and even recently, I just read an article about how China has been developing and has been testing AI that pilots its fighter jets and its military, and that it goes pretty well head to head with human pilots
wow.
in simulations and testing. So that's pretty scary. I mean, it's like drones, yeah, but when you put AI in control of weapon systems that we already have, yeah, things can
Yeah,
get pretty scary.
definitely. And Morgan, once again, thanks for being on the show today. I went public a year ago. You just went public. You didn't know who I was when
No,
you had never heard of me. So that's interesting. And but it just goes to show. I mean, it was your courage and bravery that made the difference. Really coming forward, sacrificing a lot for your family. I know you have a young kid and a baby on the way.
yeah, yeah,
So,
thanks. Hmm.
are there any other last thoughts, or maybe we can have another interview later with maybe more details, a little more in depth. But is there anything else? I guess a few words you want to leave us with as a last thought about I guess the biggest tech takeaway for the viewers about Facebook, about the threat we face?
Yeah, I would say that just remember that for Facebook, you are the product. And so the biggest danger to them is you, the user, finding out what they're doing and doing something about it, like not using Facebook anymore or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the only reasons the Facebook hasn't banned me is because I think, I'm some type of icon and, that would, to do that would be to like martyr me in some small way.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, we're not going to ban his account. So, but I'm just waiting for the ban hammer on mine. But yeah, stop using Facebook. If you don't like it that much, stop using Facebook, stop using Instagram and demand that they change or, find some other platform to use.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of it is I think we're seeing that emergence of some other competing products, Gab, PocketNet.app. So yeah, there's a wealth of different products to use. Yeah, definitely. We'll keep that in mind. Morgan, remember guys, we are the product. So just be careful about what you share on Facebook and definitely seek out those alternatives. Thanks so much for for being here today, Morgan. I hope you and your family are doing well, and we'll be in touch. Okay.
all right, cool. Thank you so much, Ryan.
Thanks.
Bye.